world where wealth often speaks louder than kindness, one man believed his money made him untouchable. Richard Thompson, a billionaire, powerful and proud, thought he could buy respect, silence the weak, and control every room he entered. One afternoon in a crowded restaurant, he proved just how cruel arrogance can be. When a humble black waitress reached out to help his little daughter, Richard shouted words that echoed like poison through the hall. "Don't touch her." Those words crushed Amelia's heart. They humiliated her in front of strangers. They reduced her to nothing in the eyes of a man who believed she was beneath him. But what Richard never imagined was that fate, or perhaps divine justice, was already writing another story. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. It was early morning in Richmond, Virginia. The old alarm clock rang at 4:30 a.m., echoing through the tiny, dimly lit room where Amelia Johnson slept. The ceiling showed stains of dampness, the paint peeling at the corners. Still, this was the only place she could afford with her waitress salary. Amelia rose quietly, careful not to wake her mother, Mrs. Helena, who slept on the worn-out sofa in the living room. Helena was an elderly woman, her face marked with deep wrinkles and a persistent cough, the consequence of decades spent cleaning factories, breathing in dust and chemicals without protection. Before leaving the room, Amelia knelt by her bed and closed her eyes. "Lord, I know my life isn't easy, but I trust your plans. Please give me strength to endure another day. Bless my mother, and let me one day achieve my dream of becoming a nurse, so I can take care of her and others in need. Amen." She stood up, adjusted her simple uniform, a white blouse already a little worn and neatly pressed black pants, and stepped into the still dark streets of the city. The crisp morning air brushed against her face as she walked, carrying in her bag the only pair of comfortable shoes she owned for work, or the restaurant. The restaurant where Amelia worked wasn't just any place. It was a luxury establishment, a gathering spot for politicians, businessmen, and the wealthiest families in town. A place where crystal chandeliers reflected against silver cutlery, and where a single dish cost more than Amelia's entire weekly paycheck. But for her, that job was a blessing. Every tip she earned, she tucked carefully away into a jar hidden in her wardrobe. That was her secret fund, the fragile foundation of her dream, nursing school. Even when customers treated her coldly or ignored her, Amelia served each table with genuine kindness. She remembered the words her mother often told her. "Daughter, life can be cruel, but never let other people's cruelty steal the goodness from your heart. Invisible among the rich." At the restaurant, Amelia moved almost like a shadow. She prepared tables, balanced trays, poured wine into sparkling glasses, and cleared plates, often without being noticed. Some clients were polite, but most saw her as part of the furniture, a servant whose job was to appear, serve, and disappear. There were days when she slipped into the locker room during breaks just to cry silently, wiping her tears before stepping back into the dining hall. But she never gave up. Deep inside, a voice kept repeating, "Do not lose faith. God does not abandon the just." The silent dream. In the few hours she had to herself, Amelia would open borrowed nursing textbooks from a neighbor. She loved imagining herself wearing a white coat, tending to patients, saving lives. She never told anyone, but every time she walked past the city hospital, she would stop for a moment, watching doctors and nurses go in and out, and whisper to herself, "One day, it will be my turn." The dream was too big for her harsh reality, but it was the fire that kept her heart alive through the daily humiliations. A premonition. That morning, however, something felt different. The restaurant staff was buzzing with preparation for an important guest. It was Richard Thompson, one of the wealthiest men in the state. Owner of multiple companies, mansions, and luxury cars, Richard was admired by many as a symbol of success. For Amelia, though, he was about to become the face of the deepest humiliation she would ever experience. As she carefully arranged the silverware on the white tablecloths, Amelia felt an inexplicable shiver run down her spine. It was as if her soul whispered, "Something is about to happen today." She had no idea that this day would mark the beginning of a chain of events. Events of pain, tears, revelations, and divine justice. The restaurant was unusually busy that morning. The staff whispered nervously as they polished wine glasses and aligned silver cutlery for the third time. It wasn't every day that Richard Thompson, the billionaire everyone in Richmond knew by name, came to dine. Richard wasn't just wealthy, he was power itself walking into a room. His companies employed thousands, his face appeared in magazines, and his donations to political campaigns gave him influence beyond imagination. Wherever he went, people stood straighter, voices lowered, and every detail was arranged to perfection. But beneath the polished image of philanthropy and success, Richard carried an arrogance that seeped into every word and gesture. He wasn't a man used to hearing no. He was used to being obeyed, feared, admired. The arrival. At exactly 12:30 p.m., a line of black luxury cars pulled up in front of the restaurant. The maître d' rushed to the entrance while waiters whispered among themselves. Amelia, standing discreetly by the side, held a tray close to her chest. Then he stepped in. Richard wore a perfectly tailored suit, his silver hair slicked back, a gold watch gleaming under the light. Beside him walked his young daughter, no older than 8. The girl had soft brown curls and curious eyes, holding tightly to a small stuffed rabbit in her hands. Customers turned their heads, some even clapped softly, as if the arrival of Richard Thompson were an event in itself. Amelia, however, lowered her eyes. She had learned long ago that men like him did not see women like her, not unless it was to remind them of their place. A small but dangerous mistake. The maître d' bowed slightly as he guided Richard and his daughter to a private table. Amelia's heart raced when her supervisor gestured toward her. "Johnson, table 3, Mr. Thompson's party." Her fingers trembled slightly as she approached with a professional smile. She greeted politely, her voice gentle. "Good afternoon, sir. May I bring you some water to start?" Richard barely looked at her. His eyes swept over Amelia for half a second, sharp, dismissive, and then he turned his gaze back to the menu as though she were invisible. The little girl, however, looked up at Amelia with innocent curiosity. She offered a shy smile. Amelia, who had always loved children, smiled warmly back. For just a moment there was a spark of human connection in the room. But Richard noticed, and that single exchange of glances planted the seed for what would soon turn into open humiliation. The coldness of the rich. Amelia poured sparkling water into Richard's glass with steady hands. She turned to serve the girl, careful not to spill a drop. Still, before she could even place the glass in front of the child, Richard raised a hand abruptly. "Not her. I'll do it." His voice was sharp, filled with authority. Amelia froze for a moment, unsure if she had heard correctly. The maître d' stepped in quickly, taking the glass from Amelia's hands with an apologetic smile forced toward Richard. Amelia stepped back, her cheeks burning, her eyes lowered to the floor. Richard leaned down to his daughter and whispered something only she could hear. The girl frowned, glancing back at Amelia with an expression of confusion, almost sadness. A silent wound. Amelia retreated, standing by the service station. She focused on folding napkins, her hands moving mechanically, though her chest felt tight. She had served countless wealthy clients before, but something about Richard's deliberate dismissal cut deeper than usual. The way he looked at her, or rather refused to look at her, made her feel less than human. She wanted to cry, but she swallowed hard. "Stay strong," she told herself. "This is just another day. God sees everything." But in truth, this was not just another day. This was the first crack in a wall that would soon collapse with all its weight. The whisper among the staff. In the kitchen, some of the other waiters murmured among themselves. They had noticed Richard's behavior. One of them, a middle-aged man named Carlos, muttered under his breath, "The man thinks he owns the world, poor Amelia." Another rolled her eyes. She better be careful. People like him don't forgive mistakes. Amelia heard them but stayed silent. She knew too well. In this job, silence was survival. a foreshadowing. The meal went on, Richard giving instructions in a commanding tone, the staff rushing to meet his every demand. The daughter barely touched her food, her eyes drifting now and then toward Amelia with a look that seemed almost pleading. Amelia forced herself to remain invisible, to endure the sharp sting of humiliation. Yet deep inside, she couldn't shake the sense that fate had just drawn her name into a story far bigger than herself. For today was only the beginning. The worst humiliation was yet to come. And when it arrived, it would not just wound her pride. It would change her life forever. The restaurant buzzed softly with the murmurs of wealthy clients enjoying their meals, the clinking of crystal glasses echoing under the chandeliers. Amelia stood at her station, steadying her breath. She had been trained to remain calm, to keep her smile no matter what. But after Richard Thompson's cold dismissal, her hand still trembled slightly. She told herself it was over, that she could finish her shift quietly, unseen. But fate had other plans. A gentle gesture. Misunderstood Richard's daughter, little Sophia, was restless at the table. She fidgeted with her fork, then with her stuffed rabbit. At one point, as she reached for her glass, it tipped slightly, spilling juice across the white linen tablecloth. The girl gasped softly. Amelia, standing nearby, instinctively rushed forward. With kindness in her eyes, she bent down with a napkin. "It's all right, sweetheart," she whispered gently, dabbing at the spill. "Accidents happen." Sophia's face relaxed. She even gave a small smile as though grateful for Amelia's warmth. But before Amelia could finish cleaning, a sharp voice cut through the air like a whip. The outburst, "Don't touch her!" The words came from Richard. His voice thundered across the dining hall, loud enough for several nearby tables to turn their heads. Amelia froze. She held the napkin midair, her heart pounding so hard she thought it would burst. Her eyes shot up to Richard, who glared down at her with eyes cold as steel. "Step back," he ordered, his jaw clenched, his voice filled with disdain. "I told you before, I don't want you anywhere near my daughter." The silence that followed was suffocating. Guests stared, some with curiosity, others with awkward discomfort. Sophia's lips quivered. She looked at her father, then at Amelia, confused and hurt. Humiliation before all. Amelia lowered the napkin slowly, her hands trembling. She wanted to speak, to explain that she was only trying to help. But her voice caught in her throat. Her supervisor rushed over, bowing nervously toward Richard. "I deeply apologize, Mr. Thompson. It won't happen again." And then, turning sharply to Amelia, his voice cut her like a blade. "Johnson, go to the back. Now." Heat rushed to Amelia's face. Her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall in front of them. She turned quickly, walking toward the kitchen, her steps heavy, her chest aching. Behind her she heard Richard mutter one final sentence, one that pierced her heart like poison. "People like her have no place touching my child." The pain of prejudice. Inside the kitchen, Amelia leaned against the wall, her knees weak. She pressed her hand against her chest, trying to steady her breathing. People like her. She had heard words like that before, whispered, spat, or hidden behind fake smiles. But to be humiliated so publicly, in front of colleagues, strangers, and an innocent child, it felt unbearable. Her tears finally broke free, streaming down her cheeks. She bit her lip to stop herself from sobbing aloud. She thought of her mother, of the sacrifices, of the dream that kept her alive through long shifts and empty nights. For a moment, she questioned everything. "Lord, why?" she whispered. "Why do you let me go through this? Am I invisible even to you?" But deep down, beneath the pain, a flicker of faith remained. She remembered her mother's words. God doesn't abandon the just. Justice may take time, but it always comes. Amelia wiped her tears quickly. She could not let Richard or anyone see her broken. She would return to the dining hall with her head held high, even if her heart was in pieces. The weight of silence. When she stepped out of the kitchen again, The whispers still lingered. Some customers avoided her gaze. A few looked at her with pity. Others smirked, as though enjoying the spectacle of a powerful man putting a poor waitress in her place. Sophia, however, stared at Amelia with wide, sorrowful eyes. She clutched her stuffed rabbit tightly, as though she understood more than her father would ever realize. Amelia smiled faintly at her, a smile filled with both pain and reassurance. It was the only thing she could offer the child in that moment. Richard noticed the exchange and narrowed his eyes. But he said nothing more. He didn't need to. His silence was a throne from which he ruled. A turning point. For Amelia, though, the wound was deeper than Richard could imagine. This humiliation wasn't just an insult. It was a turning point. She didn't know it yet, but this very moment would become the seed of something far greater. A chain of events that would one day bring Richard Thompson to his knees. Because life, as Amelia had always been taught, had a way of turning tables. And though Richard believed his wealth made him untouchable, he had just stepped into a story written not by money or power, but by destiny, by a justice far higher than his own. The golden light of the chandeliers reflected off the polished floor as Amelia returned from the kitchen. Her face was composed, but her eyes carried the weight of what had just happened. She told herself she would get through the rest of the shift quietly, invisible. But fate was not done testing her. The child's innocence. Sophia, Richard's daughter, had grown restless again. She shifted in her chair, pushing her plate away. Her father was too absorbed in his phone, tapping furiously, answering messages that seemed far more important than the little girl sitting across from him. Sophia's stuffed rabbit slipped from her lap, falling to the floor beside the table. The child leaned down to pick it up but couldn't quite reach. Amelia, who stood only a few steps away, noticed immediately. Instinctively, she moved toward the table. Her heart softened at the sight of the girl struggling. She bent down gently, retrieving the toy. With her warm smile, she handed it back. "Here you go, sweetheart. Don't let him get away again." Sophia giggled quietly, clutching the rabbit close to her chest. For a brief second, the tension melted. A simple human moment. But Richard looked up. The explosion. The air in the room shifted instantly. Richard's face darkened as though Amelia had committed an unforgivable crime. He pushed his chair back abruptly, the sound scraping loudly across the floor. "What did I tell you?" His voice thundered through the dining hall. Every conversation around them fell silent. Forks paused mid-air. All eyes turned to the powerful man and the trembling waitress. Amelia froze, the toy still halfway in her hand as Sophia clutched it tighter. Richard's glare was merciless. He pointed a finger at Amelia, his voice dripping with venom. "Don't you ever touch my daughter again, do you understand me?" The words cut through her like glass. The silence that followed was suffocating. The public shame. Amelia's lips parted, but no words came out. Her throat tightened, her chest ached. She wanted to explain, to defend herself, to say she was only helping. But her voice was trapped by the weight of humiliation. The restaurant manager rushed to the scene, bowing almost theatrically toward Richard. "I am so sorry, Mr. Thompson. This is unacceptable. I assure you it won't happen again." And then, in front of everyone, he turned sharply to Amelia, his words like a slap across her face. "Johnson, apologize now." Her cheeks burned. Tears stung her eyes, but she fought to hold them back. Slowly, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I'm sorry, sir." But Richard wasn't satisfied. He leaned closer, his words meant for everyone to hear. "You people never learn. Stay away from her, or you'll regret it." The cruelty of the phrase was intentional. It wasn't just a warning, it was a declaration, a reminder that, in his eyes, she was beneath him. Witnesses around the room, guests exchanged glances. Some looked away, ashamed for what they had witnessed. Others seemed almost entertained, their lips curled in faint smirks. Carlos, one of the older waiters, watched from the corner with clenched fists. He muttered under his breath, "Coward." picking on her in front of his own child. But no one dared speak up, because this was Richard Thompson. His money could make or break reputations with a single word. The child's tears. Sophia, meanwhile, sat frozen, her small hands gripping the stuffed rabbit, her wide eyes filled with tears. "Daddy, she was just helping me," she whispered softly. But Richard silenced her with a stern look. "Enough, Sophia. Eat your food." The little girl lowered her head, her tiny shoulders trembling. In her young heart, she couldn't understand why her father's anger was aimed at someone who had only shown her kindness. Amelia's silent prayer. Amelia retreated, her back straight, her step steady despite the storm raging inside her. She walked to the restroom, locking herself in one of the stalls. There, finally alone, the tears poured freely. She covered her face with both hands, her body shaking. Why, Lord? Why do you let people like him humiliate those who are only trying to survive? Her sobs echoed in the empty room. But after several minutes, she wiped her face, looked at her reflection in the cracked mirror, and whispered with trembling lips, "God doesn't abandon the just. He sees everything. He will lift me up when the time comes." And with that, she steadied herself. She refused to let Richard see her broken. The scar left behind. When she stepped back into the dining hall, the whispers still floated in the air. The humiliation hung like smoke, impossible to clear. Sophia glanced at her again, her eyes filled with guilt and sadness, as though the child carried the shame her father lacked. Richard, however, continued his meal as if nothing had happened. For him, Amelia was already erased. Just another servant silenced, another day of power unquestioned. But he had made a mistake. Because in trying to crush her spirit, Richard had unknowingly set into motion the very story that would one day undo him. And Amelia, though humiliated, though scarred, carried within her a strength Richard would never understand. A strength born not of wealth but of faith, love, and the unshakable belief that justice always comes, one way or another. The restroom was silent, dimly lit, with the faint hum of the air conditioner filling the emptiness. Amelia leaned against the sink, her hands gripping the cold porcelain as her entire body trembled. Her chest rose and fell in rapid breaths, her eyes stinging from the tears she could no longer hold back. She had survived insults before. She had endured customers who snapped their fingers at her like she was less than human, colleagues who laughed behind her back, landlords who treated her like a burden. But this was different. This humiliation had been loud, public, brutal, spoken by a man so powerful that no one dared to defend her. In that dining room, she hadn't just been dismissed. She had been erased. Breaking point. Amelia covered her mouth with both hands as the sobs finally broke free. They came from deep within her chest, raw and unstoppable. She slid down against the wall, sitting on the cold tile floor, curling into herself as though trying to disappear. "Why, Lord?" she cried between sobs. "Why must I always be the one humiliated? Haven't I suffered enough? Haven't we suffered enough?" Her mind flashed with memories of her childhood, of her mother working 2 jobs, coming home with blistered hands, only to be called nothing by people who would never know her sacrifices. Of the times Amelia herself was mocked at school, not because of who she was, but because of the color of her skin and the poverty that clung to her like a shadow. And now, in front of dozens of strangers, in front of a little girl who had looked at her with kindness, she had been treated like dirt. "Am I invisible even to you, Lord?" she whispered, her voice breaking. A whisper of faith. Silence lingered for a long moment. Amelia's sobs softened, replaced by the slow, uneven rhythm of exhausted breathing. Then in the stillness she remembered her mother's voice, gentle, steady, full of faith even in the hardest of times. "Daughter, the world may look down on us, but God never does. He sees the tears no one else sees. He lifts the humble and brings down the proud. Never forget that." Amelia closed her eyes, pressing her forehead to her knees. Slowly, her sobs faded into whispers of prayer. "Lord, I don't understand your plan, but I trust you. Please, give me strength not to hate him. Give me strength to keep going." She wiped her tears with the edge of her sleeve. The red puffiness around her eyes betrayed her pain, but her spirit was slowly regaining balance. The mirror. Rising to her feet, she faced the mirror above the sink. Her reflection stared back at her, a young woman with tired eyes, her hair slightly undone from the rush, her uniform no longer crisp. But behind the weariness, there was something else. Strength. She whispered to herself almost like a vow, "He may see me as nothing, but I know who I am. I am my mother's daughter. I am God's child, and one day justice will speak for me." The words weren't just comfort. They were a promise she carried deep in her heart. Returning to the battlefield, Amelia washed her face, retying her hair into a neat bun. She adjusted her uniform, squared her shoulders, and took a deep breath. By the time she opened the bathroom door, she was no longer a woman defeated. She was a woman scarred, yes, but not broken. She stepped back into the restaurant, the hum of conversations resuming, though she could still feel the lingering stares. Some customers avoided her eyes, others watched with curiosity, waiting to see if she would crumble again. But Amelia walked with quiet dignity, her tray balanced in her hands, her head held just high enough to show she would not be destroyed. The silent observer. Sophia noticed her return immediately. The little girl's eyes softened, filled with the kind of compassion children naturally possess. She gave Amelia a tiny smile, a fragile gesture, but one that carried more kindness than all the adults in the room combined. Amelia returned the smile faintly as though telling the child, "I'll be okay." Richard, however, never looked her way again. To him, the matter was closed. He had humiliated her, reminded her of her place, and moved on. But what he didn't realize was that his cruelty had left a scar far deeper than he could imagine, one that destiny itself was already preparing to turn against him. After the shift, when the restaurant finally emptied, Amelia stayed late, wiping tables and stacking chairs long after the others had gone. She moved slowly, her body drained, her mind heavy. Carlos, the older waiter, passed by and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You didn't deserve that, Amelia," he said quietly. "Don't let him steal your spirit. Men like him, they think money makes them gods, but it doesn't. Remember that." She nodded, her throat tightening. "Thank you, Carlos." It was a small comfort, but it mattered. The walk home. That night, Amelia walked home under the dim streetlights. The city was quiet, the sidewalks nearly empty. Each step felt heavy, but she lifted her eyes to the starless sky and whispered one last prayer. "Lord, if this humiliation is part of your plan, then I will endure it. But please, don't let my mother see me broken. Give me strength for her." Her mother was already asleep when Amelia returned. She quietly covered her with a blanket, then sat by the window in silence. Though her heart still ached, she held on to one unshakable belief. Humiliation is never the end of the story. And she was right. For soon, Richard Thompson, the man who thought himself untouchable, would face a trial no amount of money or pride could shield him from. The days following the humiliating incident seemed to return to normal, at least on the surface. Richard Thompson continued his busy life, attending meetings, hosting dinners, signing contracts worth millions. His wealth and power were, as always, untouchable. But inside his mansion, behind the iron gates and the long driveway lined with manicured trees, a shadow began to fall. The first signs. It started quietly. Little Sophia, once full of energy, grew tired more easily. She no longer ran through the garden with her rabbit in hand. Instead, she preferred to lie on the couch, her small frame wrapped in a blanket. At first, Richard dismissed it. Children catch colds, he thought. A little rest, some vitamins, and she'd be fine. But then came the fevers. High, burning fevers that drenched her sheets with sweat in the middle of the night. Her nanny, Maria, rushed to Richard's office one evening, panic in her eyes. "Sir, she's not well. She hasn't eaten all day, and her temperature keeps climbing. We should call a doctor." Richard looked up from his laptop. annoyed by the interruption. But when he saw his daughter's pale face, her lips trembling as she whispered, "Daddy, I don't feel good," something inside him cracked. Doctors and uncertainty. The finest pediatrician in Richmond was summoned immediately, then another, and another. They examined Sophia with cold stethoscopes, shining lights into her eyes, taking samples of blood. Each time, Richard waited impatiently, expecting a clear answer, a quick solution. But the answers never came. It could be an infection, but her tests don't match the symptoms. Let's try stronger antibiotics. We'll run more tests. Nothing worked. Days turned into weeks and Sophia grew weaker. The once bright sparkle in her eyes dimmed, replaced by exhaustion and pain. A father's desperation. For the first time in his life, Richard felt powerless. He sat by his daughter's bedside at night, holding her small hand in his. She looked up at him with tired eyes, whispering, "Daddy, why do I feel so sick? Am I going to die?" His chest tightened. No business rival, no negotiation, no deal had ever made him tremble like those words from his little girl. He forced a smile, brushing her curls from her forehead. "No, sweetheart, you're going to be fine. Daddy will fix this, I promise." But as soon as she closed her eyes, he turned away, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with a fear he couldn't admit aloud. Richard Thompson was a man used to solving everything with power and money. Yet now no amount of wealth could buy his daughter's health. The city begins to whisper. It didn't take long for the news to spread. Rumors circulated quietly through Richmond. Richard Thompson's daughter is very ill. At the restaurant where Amelia worked, the staff whispered too. Some pitied the child. Others said Richard was finally tasting what life was like for everyone else. Powerless, uncertain. Amelia overheard them one night in the locker room. Her heart sank. She remembered Sophia's kind eyes, the little girl who had smiled at her even when her father spat cruelty. She closed her eyes and whispered softly, "Lord, please protect that child. She doesn't deserve to suffer." Despite her own humiliation, Amelia carried no bitterness toward the girl. Her compassion was too strong, her heart too full of faith to wish harm on an innocent child. Sleepless nights. Meanwhile, Richard's mansion was no longer filled with laughter or music. The grand dining hall sat empty. The endless phone calls to business partners went unanswered as Richard spent his nights pacing the floor, sleepless, waiting for doctors' reports that never brought good news. He watched his daughter shrinking before his eyes, her tiny body frail against the oversized pillows. Each cough felt like a dagger. Each fever stole another piece of his pride. The man who once silenced a waitress with arrogance now found himself silenced by something far greater. The fear of losing the only person he truly loved. A turning tide. One night, after Sophia had been rushed to the hospital with dangerously high fever, Richard sat alone in the sterile white hallway. His hands shook, his heart heavy with a helplessness he had never known. For the first time in years, Richard Thompson, the billionaire who thought himself untouchable, bowed his head and whispered words he hadn't spoken since childhood. "God, if you're real, please, don't take her from me." It was a prayer born not of faith but of desperation. But it marked the beginning of a shift. Because destiny was already weaving the path that would bring his world crashing down. And ironically, the person he had most despised would soon be the very key to his daughter's survival. The hospital was buzzing with the familiar rhythm of emergencies, the squeak of gurney wheels, the distant cries of patients, the intercom calling for doctors. The air smelled of disinfectant and fear, the kind of atmosphere that reminded Amelia of why she had always dreamed of becoming a nurse. But Amelia wasn't there as a nurse. She was there as an employee of the hospital cafeteria, having recently taken on the second job to help pay her mother's growing medical bills. Life had not given her the chance to study yet, but she wasn't giving up. Every extra shift brought her one step closer to that dream. That evening, she tied her apron tightly, stacked trays of sandwiches and coffee, and prepared to deliver them to the waiting area. She had no idea that destiny was about to place her face to face with the very man who had tried to erase her dignity. a familiar name. As she arranged the food cart, two nurses passed by, speaking in hushed voices. "It's Thompson's daughter. She's back again. Poor little thing, nothing seems to work. And her father, he's furious. You can feel the pressure on the doctors. Money can't fix this one." Amelia froze. The name Thompson rang in her chest like a bell. She didn't need anyone to tell her who that was. There was only one Richard Thompson in Richmond. Her mind raced. His daughter, Sophia, she's sick? Amelia's heart tightened. She remembered the girl's innocent smile, her shy giggle when Amelia had picked up the stuffed rabbit, and she remembered the tears in her eyes when her father had shouted, "Don't touch her." A part of Amelia wanted to turn away, to avoid the risk of facing him again. But another part, the stronger part, knew she couldn't ignore the child's suffering. The waiting room. When Amelia entered the waiting room with her cart, her eyes scanned the room quickly, and then she saw him. Richard Thompson. He sat in one of the stiff hospital chairs, his expensive suit wrinkled, his hair disheveled, his hands clasped tightly together. He didn't look like the untouchable billionaire from the restaurant. He looked human, exhausted, desperate. Beside him, through the glass window of the pediatric ward, Sophia lay in a hospital bed. Her face was pale, her tiny body connected to IV tubes, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. For a moment, Amelia's breath caught in her throat. The sight pierced her heart. The clash of worlds. Richard looked up, and his eyes met Amelia's. For a split second, the room froze. Recognition flashed across his face. Shock, then discomfort. Finally, a shadow of shame, quickly masked by the same arrogance he always carried. His jaw tightened. His voice was sharp, though lower than before. "What are you doing here?" Amelia steadied herself. She would not cower this time. She lifted her chin slightly, her voice calm but firm. "I work here, in the cafeteria." Richard's eyes narrowed. He wanted to dismiss her, to wave her away like an unwanted shadow. But he didn't, perhaps because for the first time, he wasn't the one in control. The nurse's eyes. Other families in the waiting room noticed the tension. The nurses, too, watched carefully. They knew who Richard was, but they also knew Amelia, kind, hardworking, respected among the staff. For once, Richard wasn't the center of admiration. He was simply another parent waiting helplessly for answers. And Amelia, though only a cafeteria worker in their eyes, carried herself with quiet dignity. A moment of humanity. Sophia stirred in her bed, her eyes fluttering open. She looked around the room, weak but aware. When her gaze landed on Amelia, her lips curved faintly into a smile. "You," she whispered, her voice raspy but soft. Amelia stepped closer to the glass, placing her hand gently against it. She smiled back. "Rest, sweetheart. You'll be all right." Richard turned toward his daughter, surprised. Sophia's eyes shone with recognition and trust for the woman his arrogance had tried to erase. For the first time, Richard didn't know what to say. The turning of the tide. Amelia excused herself quietly, pushing her cart away, but her presence lingered in the room like a whisper. Richard leaned back in his chair, staring at the floor. He hated to admit it, even to himself, but something gnawed at him. The memory of his cruel words in the restaurant, the way Amelia had been humiliated in front of everyone. And now, here she was again, not as an enemy, not seeking revenge, but offering kindness to his daughter with no bitterness in her eyes. It unsettled him more than he could explain. Destiny at work. That night, as the doctors continued their tests and Richard tried to hide his growing despair, Amelia finished her shift and walked home under the cool Virginia night. She prayed silently as she walked. "Lord, if you put me in that hospital today, it was for a reason. Show me what you want me to do." She didn't know yet that the answer was already unfolding. That very soon, a truth hidden for years would come to light. And when it did, it would not only shake Richard's world, it would change Amelia's life forever. The hospital room was quiet except for the rhythmic beeping of the monitors. Richard sat by Sophia's bedside, his hand holding hers gently, as if afraid she might slip away if he let go. The girl's skin was pale, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. Doctors and nurses moved in and out of the room, their faces tight with worry, their conversations whispered. Richard hated whispers. In business, he demanded clarity, control, immediate solutions. But here, no amount of money or power could demand certainty. He was a man used to buying answers. Yet tonight, no one could give him the one he wanted. Your daughter will be fine. The test results. Finally, the door opened and Dr. Matthews, the hospital's chief pediatrician, entered with a thick folder of results in his hands. His face carried the heaviness of a man about to deliver news that would change everything. Richard rose to his feet immediately. Tell me, what's wrong with her? The doctor hesitated. He glanced at Sophia, who was half asleep, clutching her stuffed rabbit, before leading Richard just outside the room. Mr. Thompson, we've run extensive tests. Sophia's symptoms aren't caused by an infection or something simple. Her bone marrow isn't producing enough healthy cells. She's severely anemic, and her immune system is failing. If we don't act soon... Richard's chest tightened. He interrupted, his voice sharp, almost pleading. Then act. Do whatever you have to do. I don't care what it costs. Dr. Matthews shook his head gravely. Money isn't the issue. What she needs is a bone marrow transplant. Without it, she may not survive. The words struck Richard like a thunderclap. A transplant. He had expected medicine, treatment, something fixable with his wealth. But this was beyond his control. Searching for a match. Richard straightened, his voice firm. Fine. Then test me. Test everyone in my family. We'll find a match. The doctor nodded. We already did. Neither you nor your relatives are compatible. Richard's breath caught in his throat. What do you mean? Dr. Matthews sighed. Finding a bone marrow match is complicated. It usually comes from close family. But in Sophia's case, no one related to her is suitable. We're expanding the search to the National Registry, but the chances are slim without a closer match. Richard's hands trembled. For the first time in his life, he felt utterly powerless. So what do I do? Just sit here while my daughter dies? His voice cracked, breaking through the armor of pride he wore so tightly. The unlikely discovery. The next morning, new tests were run, samples processed. Nurses moved quickly, doctors consulted in hushed urgency. Then, late in the afternoon, Dr. Matthews returned, his expression cautious but hopeful. Mr. Thompson, we found a potential match. Someone on staff here at the hospital cafeteria volunteered for our donor program months ago. Their tissue compatibility with Sophia is nearly perfect. Richard blinked, stunned. Cafeteria staff. He frowned. Who? The doctor glanced down at the file, then looked Richard directly in the eye. Her name is Amelia Johnson. The air seemed to collapse around him. Richard staggered back a step, his mind reeling. That name, that face. The waitress he had humiliated, dismissed, treated as less than human, and now she was the only person who could save his daughter's life. A bitter irony. Richard's mouth went dry. He couldn't speak. His pride fought against the reality, his arrogance against the truth. But there it was, undeniable. Dr. Matthews continued, If Amelia agrees, Sophia can undergo the transplant immediately. Time is critical. Without it. Richard interrupted, his voice trembling. She'll die. The doctor nodded solemnly. A father-crushed Richard pressed his hand against the wall, his body weak. For decades he had believed himself untouchable. He thought his money could buy loyalty, respect, even love. But now, standing in the sterile hallway of a hospital, his billions meant nothing. The life of his daughter depended on the mercy of a woman he had treated with cruelty and contempt. Sophia stirred weakly in her bed. Through the glass, Richard saw her tiny lips moving. Daddy? Her voice was faint, fragile. He rushed to her side, kneeling by her bed. "I'm here, sweetheart. I won't let anything happen to you. I promise." But deep down, he knew the truth. The promise he had made was no longer in his hands. It rested in the hands of Amelia Johnson, the woman he had once forbidden to touch his daughter. And soon, Richard Thompson, the man who had looked down on the humble, would be forced to bow his head and ask for grace. The cafeteria was nearly empty that evening. Amelia stacked trays quietly, her body tired from the long shift, her heart still heavy from the memory of Richard's humiliation. She was about to clock out when she heard her name over the hospital intercom. "Amelia Johnson, please report to Dr. Matthews' office immediately." Her heart skipped a beat. She thought perhaps something had happened to her mother. She hurried through the halls, her mind racing. But when she entered the office, she found Dr. Matthews waiting, and Richard Thompson sitting stiffly in a chair, his eyes lowered, his pride visibly strained. The proposal, Dr. Matthews gestured for Amelia to sit. "Amelia, thank you for coming. There's something important we need to discuss." She nodded cautiously, her gaze flickering toward Richard, who avoided meeting her eyes. The doctor continued, his voice calm but urgent. "We've discovered that you're a near-perfect match for Sophia Thompson. She needs a bone marrow transplant immediately, and you are her only chance." The words struck Amelia like a lightning bolt. "Me?" she whispered. Dr. Matthews nodded. "Yes. If you agree, the procedure could save her life." Amelia's eyes widened. She thought of the little girl, her fragile smile, the way she had looked at her with kindness even when her father's words cut deep. And then she remembered the cruel echo in her ears. "Don't touch my daughter." Now, irony had turned those words into divine justice. The silence in the room, the air in the office was heavy. Richard finally lifted his gaze, his eyes filled with something Amelia had never seen in him before. Not arrogance, not disdain, but desperation. For a moment he tried to speak, but his throat tightened. He swallowed hard, then finally forced the words out. "Please, help her." Amelia blinked. She had never expected to hear the word "please" from a man like Richard. Her heart trembled, torn between the memory of her pain and the innocence of Sophia, who bore none of her father's pride. She pressed her lips together, her voice steady but firm. "I'll do it. For her. Not for you." Richard closed his eyes, exhaling shakily. He had no choice but to accept her terms. The hidden connection. As the paperwork began, more tests were ordered. Dr. Matthews returned the following day, his expression unusually grave. "Amelia, Richard, there's something you both need to know. When we cross-checked Amelia's tissue match with Sophia's, the compatibility was unusually strong. Stronger than most unrelated donors." Richard frowned. "What are you saying?" Dr. Matthews hesitated, then looked directly at Amelia. "Genetically speaking, you and Sophia share more than a donor-recipient match. The markers suggest a familial connection. Amelia, biologically, you could very well be Sophia's half-sister." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Amelia's hands trembled. "Her sister?" she whispered. Richard's face went pale. He rose to his feet abruptly, his voice unsteady. "That's impossible." But deep down, he knew it wasn't. "The truth revealed, Doctor." Matthews continued. "This isn't something we can ignore. Amelia's genetic markers match Sophia's on a level that can only be explained by a direct blood relation. Richard, I need to ask, is there something in your past that could explain this?" Amelia turned to Richard, her eyes burning. "What does he mean? Tell me the truth." Richard's lips pressed tightly together. He wanted to deny it, to bury the past. But the weight of science and the urgency of his daughter's life left him no room to hide. Finally, with a voice heavy with shame, he confessed, "Years ago, before I married Sophia's mother, I had a relationship with a woman who worked for one of my companies. She was young, kind, but poor. My family didn't approve. I walked away. I told myself it was better that way." Amelia's eyes filled with tears. Her chest tightened. "That woman, was my mother. Richard staggered back as though struck. The truth had shattered the walls he had built around his pride. The shock of destiny. Amelia's voice trembled, but it was strong with conviction. All these years you looked down on me. You humiliated me. And yet, I am blood to the daughter you love more than anything, the same daughter you forbade me to touch. The irony of it filled the room like divine thunder. Richard sat down heavily, his face in his hands. His empire, his arrogance, his untouchable image, all of it meant nothing now. He had despised the very flesh and blood that could save his child's life. Dr. Matthews cleared his throat gently. Amelia, I know this is overwhelming, but we need your decision quickly. Sophia's condition is worsening by the hour. Amelia closed her eyes. She thought of her mother, of the sacrifices, of the prayers whispered every night. She thought of Sophia's innocent eyes, the way the little girl had smiled at her despite everything. When she opened her eyes again, her tears sparkled with both pain and strength. I'll do it, not for him, for her, and because God did not put me here by accident. The morning of the surgery arrived. The hospital corridors buzzed with urgency, yet in the sterile stillness of the operating ward, time seemed to stand still. Amelia sat in a white gown, waiting for the procedure that would change everything. She clasped her hands tightly together, whispering a prayer. Lord, guide the doctors. Protect Sophia. Let this sacrifice be enough to give her life again. I put everything in your hands. In another room, Richard stood by Sophia's bed. He watched his daughter's fragile chest rise and fall. Her little hand clutched his tightly, her voice weak but full of trust. Daddy, I'll be okay, right? His throat closed. For once, the man who had always had the answers could only whisper, trembling, Yes, sweetheart. You'll be okay. Because someone very brave is helping you. The operation. The doctors worked tirelessly. Hours passed. Bone marrow was harvested from Amelia with precision and care, then transplanted into Sophia. Nurses moved swiftly, machines beeped steadily, and prayers filled the hearts of everyone who had witnessed the story unfold. Outside the operating room, Richard paced endlessly. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair a mess, his face etched with fear. He wasn't the billionaire in control of empires. He was simply a father, powerless, desperate, humbled. The wait, finally, Dr. Matthews emerged. His face, though tired, carried a faint smile. The transplant was successful. Now we wait for Sophia's body to accept it. She has a real chance. Richard nearly collapsed with relief. For the first time in days, he felt hope. But then his eyes shifted to the other end of the hall, where Amelia, pale and weak from the procedure, was being wheeled back into recovery. His chest tightened with shame. He remembered his cruel words, "Don't touch her." And yet, here was Amelia, the woman he had despised, who had just given his daughter the chance to live. A father bows. Later that evening, Richard walked slowly into Amelia's room. She was lying in bed, her face pale, her eyes heavy, but there was a quiet strength about her. She turned her head and met his gaze. For a long moment he couldn't speak. His lips trembled, his pride waged war inside him. But finally, Richard Thompson, the man who had humiliated her before strangers, lowered his head. "Amelia, I was wrong." His voice cracked. "I judged you. I hurt you. And yet you saved the most precious thing in my life. I can never repay what you've done." Tears filled Amelia's eyes. She had longed for this, not his wealth, not his approval, but this moment of truth. She spoke softly. "I didn't do it for you. I did it for her. And because God taught me that the right thing is never to answer hate with hate." Richard nodded, tears slipping down his face. For once, the proud man had no defense, no excuse. Only gratitude and humility. Sophia's smile days later. Sophia began to recover. Color slowly returned to her cheeks. Her smile returned to her lips. She clutched her stuffed rabbit and looked at Amelia, who visited her quietly. "Thank you," the little girl whispered. You're like an angel. Amelia's heart swelled. She brushed Sophia's hair gently and smiled. No, sweetheart. I'm just your sister, and I'll always be here for you. Sophia's eyes widened with joy. Sister? She repeated, as if the word itself was a gift. Richard watched from the corner, his heart pierced by the truth. The daughter he loved most had found a sister in the woman he had once forbidden to touch her. Divine justice. News of the story spread beyond the hospital. People whispered about the billionaire who had been humbled, about the waitress whose kindness saved a life. Some called it fate. Others called it a miracle. But Amelia knew what it was: divine justice. The man who had once humiliated her had been forced to kneel, not before her but before the truth, that God raises the humble and shatters the pride of the arrogant. A new beginning. Amelia returned to her modest life, still working hard, still dreaming of becoming a nurse. But now she walked with her head higher, her spirit stronger. She had faced the deepest humiliation and emerged not as a victim, but as a vessel of grace. Richard, too, was changed. His wealth remained, but his arrogance had been broken. He began to support scholarships for underprivileged students, starting with Amelia's nursing education. For the first time, his money was used not for vanity, but for redemption. And Sophia, the little girl caught in the middle, grew up knowing that kindness, not pride, was the truest form of strength. Life has a way of turning the tables when we least expect it. Amelia, the humble waitress once humiliated in front of strangers, became the very instrument God used to save the life of the man's daughter who had despised her. Richard Thompson had all the money in the world, yet none of it could protect him from the truth, that wealth and pride crumble before the power of love, faith, and divine justice. The man who once shouted, "Don't touch my daughter," was forced to watch as that very daughter's life rested in the hands of the woman he had treated as nothing. And in the end, he bowed, not to Amelia, but to the truth of a God who never abandons the humble. Amelia's story reminds us that no matter how invisible the world may try to make us feel, God sees us. He lifts the broken, He exalts the humble, and He brings down the proud. And you, watching this story, have you ever experienced something similar? Have you ever been humiliated only to see justice arrive in an unexpected way? Share your story in the comments below. Do you believe that divine justice always comes, even if late? Write your answer. Your words may inspire someone else. Never lose hope. The road may be long and injustice may wound us deeply, but remember, the just are never forgotten. Because in the end, no matter how powerful the arrogant may seem, the good always wins.